Other countries continued to maintain forces so large that they posed a constant threat of aggression. And this year, the invasion of Korea has shown that there are some who will resort to outright war, contrary to the principles of the Charter if it suits their end.
The Korean War started, and they started a new carrier division staff. We're going to bring back a lot of aircraft carriers. That means we got to have at least another admiral out here to help run it. And the admiral will have to have a staff, and he'll have to have a flag secretary and aide. And I got pegged as the guy. I was one ticked-off aviator. I was ticked off at the Navy because I felt that they just wouldn't let me get started. I couldn't really get on the track that I envisioned. I said, look, I couldn't get to combat World War II. We now got a war, and you're going to send me as a flag secretary to an admiral. I'm going to be an administrative job. I'm at least going to be in the combat theater. But no way. Do this, and then we'll put you in a squadron. The old military promise, standard routine. But it ended up a wonderful experience. Fortunately, the admiral who was ordered in to head up the staff was terrific. It was Admiral Eddie Ewan, Naval Academy class of 1921. He'd been the captain of the football team both his junior and senior years. And for years, he was touted as one of the greatest football players from the Naval Academy at all time. But football was a great teacher for him. He learned an awful lot about combat, so forth. And he came in. We were going to set up the staff, take about 3 months, and then deploy. He gets a phone call from the Chief Naval Operations in Washington. The second day he was aboard the staff after he reported. He gets a phone call from Forrest Sherman, the boss. Says, Eddie, I need you out there right now. Right now. So he checked in one day, and 2 days later, he checked out, and the last thing he did, we'd had at least 45 minutes together. The last thing he did is he turned to me, he says, I just called Washington, and you're going to get a set of orders. You follow me out. 2 weeks later, I was in the Yellow Sea with him aboard the USS Philippine Sea. Frustration is what that first year of the Korean War was. The admiral comes aboard. I'm a member of the staff. I'm pretty close to him. The first thing that we were involved in was trying to support the troops in the Busan perimeter. These are the Army guys who got beaten down, pushed, thought they were going to be shoved into the ocean. Only North Koreans were the enemy. The Chinese hadn't come in. And we're trying to support them. We got 2 aircraft carriers with all its capability to haul ordnance over, and we get to the troops in the Busan perimeter. The guys, this is the pilots, get there. They can't communicate. We haven't developed the procedures. The Army guys didn't understand the Navy Marine close air support routine. Yeah. Complicating the fact was that the Air Force had said we're going to get into jets as soon as we can. They had a squadron of F-80 jets, one of the earliest jets we ever had. They had a whole squadron of them, at Itazuki Air Force Base on the southern tip of Japan. And they were going to get involved, so they'd load up with a couple of little bombs, fly across the Straits of Tsushima, get to the Busan perimeter. Emergency, emergency, I got to have a target right now because I'm about to run out of fuel. So that screwed it all up. It was a very frustrating period. And of course, by this time, the USS Boxer is recalled, put into service, and brings a carrier load of P-51 aircraft over so that the Air Force would have some airplanes that they could use for this kind of warfare. We just jumped ahead, and we didn't have the procedures worked out. So it was a very frustrating period, and nobody was more frustrated than this admiral that I was serving, that I was with. He was in charge. He had the capability to help out, and we couldn't get the thing going. The Busan perimeter was a real test of American aviation fighting power. Survival in combat is a lot of it's innovation. If you can't innovate, you're in trouble. Or if you're not with somebody that can innovate. You got to have a leader that can innovate. And MacArthur had a guy who was in charge of the 7th Fleet, and named Rip Struble, Vice Admiral Rip Struble, U.S. Naval Academy class of 17. Big amphibious sailor in World War II. A lot of experience with landings. And he and MacArthur got together and came up with the idea that, hey, let's put 10,000 troops ashore up in Incheon on the LOC side. They'll be well behind the Busan perimeter. We'll cut them off. We'll cut off the reinforcements, and this will be an innovative move. 10,000 armies and Marines, whatnot. And we got a couple of aircraft carriers. They'll supply the support. They'll soften up the defenses, and then they'll supply the support that's necessary once we get the campaign going. We pull into Sasebo Harbor on the 1st of September with the task force, the carrier task force. The Admiral Struble, comes aboard to brief us on the Incheon landings. First we'd ever heard of it. Great idea. We write the operations orders, get out, go to sea, start softening up the defenses. And then the landing comes in on the 15th of September. 10,000 soldiers and Marines go ashore. The high tides are fantastic, but they were able to do it safely. We had good cover, didn't lose anybody on that thing. It was a fantastic operation, and it was exactly what was needed. Innovation, the part of the leaders, great idea. The North Koreans were defeated. They retreated, a lot of prisoners, took a lot of prisoners, and that phase of the war was fine. It's all over. My God, the war is over. And I remember with the Admiral, he took me with him. We went on a victory tour. And then we got the word that, hey, the Chinese are in it, back aboard ship, and out we go west. And then we started getting into it in earnest. We were out there until the spring of 51, but, well, it was almost 9 months because my third child was born the day after I got back. So, and I remember it was almost a 9-month period. But a senior admiral came in, took over. We were finished. Admiral Eddie Ewan, he was ordered up to Alameda to be in charge of 5 air wings that were either deployed or getting ready to deploy. He took me with him up there. I was the personnel officer, whatnot, but then he let me go to night fighter training for a couple of months, which was the greatest training program I've ever had in my life. There's nothing like flying an airplane, a fighter airplane around off of Hawaii. It's no horizon, no lights, and flying what we call partial panel. You got nothing but needle ball, airspeed, and altimeter. You're up there flying a pattern around. You learn how to come up behind a guy at night and pick him up on the little radar we had. It was wonderful training, terrific. He let me go to that and came back, and he saw to it that I got command of a jet fighter squadron that was going to deploy in a few months to the Korean theater. I was really well qualified. I had 1.0 hours of time in a jet aircraft when I took command of the squadron. And I had people report to me that had never been in a jet at all. That was the way we got into jets in the Korean War. I learned how to fly the jet really. I learned about jet by taking a movie projector home with some film. And in my living room, I learned how a jet engine was, the whole thing. I had one flight that somebody let me fly one of the birds when I came back from Korea the first time, but I had the 1 hour flight time. But I was the commanding officer, and I had more than a lot of other people. You got to remember that in the Korean War, this was where we were introducing jets into naval aviation. We started with a job from McDonnell Douglas called the Banshee. We actually deployed some of them in the early days to the Korean theater. The bad thing about the Banshee was it was a nice airplane and flew well. We'd put it in air shows and everything else. But if you pulled real hard on the stick, the wings had a little trouble staying aboard. I mean, it just wasn't the perfect airplane for that. Grumman came along with a typical Grumman Iron Works product called the F9F2. It was it was almost a kiddie car, really, when you think about it, but it was a straight wing designed so that you could take the tail off from the rest of it, and easy for maintenance, changing engines and things like that nature. But getting it aboard the carrier was pretty hairy because we used the same technique that we did in World War II. You started over here, the carrier started at 180 degrees. You came around about the stall, just above the stall speed, and then you cut the power and settled down on the deck, and where we used to have about 7 or 8 or 10 or I forget how many wires we had in World War II carriers, but when you got with the jets, the number of wires was reduced, and they had these little barriers, about 3 or 4 barrier fences, made a wire that you'd run into if you didn't catch a hook. And if you bounced over, you'd ended up with the airplanes that were parked forward. It was hairy stuff. In those days, we didn't have any big training programs. It was up to the commanding officers to get his pilots trained. And fortunately, I had a cadre of 7 young officers that had made the tour with the squadron before. They'd come out of the Naval Academy or Stanford or University of Oklahoma. They were just wonderful people. And went to flight training, got out of flight training, got into jets, went right to Korea. So they were in some of the early deployments. I inherited them. They were the nucleus. They were the brains. They were teaching me what it was all about. And we worked out a training schedule and for the young pilots that were coming in. We didn't have any established program. It was up to the squadron commander to train his people for the combat that he was going to experience. And we had 8 or 9 months to do this. So but we worked out a schedule for these young guys. It was terrific. And of course, it was tremendous experience and leadership in learning how to do this. I had about 150, 200 men in a squadron. I had 25, 26 pilots, and went through all the routine of getting them ready to go to combat. And was good stuff. We started with the Valley Forge, and then we had the Philippine Sea. They had 2 squadrons of jet aircraft. That's 16-plane squadrons. They had 32 jet aircraft aboard these ships. Then they had a squadron of 16, called AD, the wonderful workhorse we would love to have had in World War II, but came along after World War II. We had a squadron of those. They talked about they could carry the same bomb load that a B-17 could, but it was a wonderful airplane, dive bomber, torpedoes, whatever you wanted. And then we had a squadron of the old World War II Corsairs. So we had 32 prop aircraft, 32 jet aircraft. One of the things that we spent a lot of time on and preparing for combat was what happens if somebody gets shot down behind enemy lines. Gets hit, can't get out to the sea to parachute into the water, ends up on land. And we would practice this at the hills up behind behind San Francisco, to the east of San Francisco, in the mountains there. We'd go out with jeeps, and we had banners that we'd rig, and we'd go through the procedures of circling around. One guy goes high to communicate, and the others go down to drive off the enemy and so forth. We spent a lot of time on that, practicing it. But it was standard doctrine that you did not want to become a prisoner of war. It's interesting, and I've studied the prisoner of war thing quite a bit in both Korea and Vietnam, but it was pretty interesting that when we were with the Koreans, fighting the Koreans, and they were capturing people, they were vicious. The North Koreans were really vicious. When the Chinese came in, they took over the POW business, and that was a different group. The Koreans worked on your body. The Chinese worked on your mind. And one of my great associations, he started before the Korean War, was a chief petty officer named Dwayne Thorin, Thorin. He became one of our first helicopter pilots. They would have air-sea rescue duty. The ship would go in fairly close to the beach. The call would come, said pilots shot down, or troops in trouble or whatnot. He would go in with his helicopter and pluck them out, bring them back. He had quite a list of saves when you stop and think about it. Well, as it happens, he ends up in a sad situation where the helicopter has some accidents. He becomes a POW. They wrote a book about the ride from Panmunjom, I think, where he talks about all of the people that he was involved with in POW camp. But he was a master psychologist. One of the cute stories that he told me about it was he had an interrogator, a Chinese interrogator, who was a chain smoker. And the Chinese technique was to get you convinced that your system, the capitalist system, your way of life was wrong. Theirs was better, and convert over to theirs. And that's what he kept working on, the mind thing. But he was a chain smoker, and Thorin didn't smoke. He was a non-smoker, but he didn't tell the guy that. Every time I'd come in for a session, the guy was going to be friendly, and he'd offer him a cigarette. Thorin wouldn't take the cigarette. No way. No, thank you very much. No cigarette. So finally, after several sessions, according to Thorin, the interrogator says, Thorin, I don't understand. He says, I try to be kind to you. I offer you a cigarette. You won't take a cigarette. Why won't you take a cigarette from me? And Thorin sat him and says, I don't smoke. Why don't I smoke? Because I think it's a sign of moral weakness. I got another interrogator. Another continued. The mind is just unbelievable. But a little simple story like that illustrated so much about how human beings function. Being a squadron commander in the Korean War could be very frustrating because, as I indicated earlier, it was over at when we finished off the Busan perimeter before the Chinese came in. It was essentially over. Then we fought up and down the peninsula with the Chinese, and at the end of 1 year, in June, July of 1951, we started negotiations between the two sides, and they got hung up on the prisoners of war issue, and we could never get it resolved. So they agreed to fight, continue the fighting. They deployed with 21 guys to get into this thing. They were aggressive. And right off the bat, we lose somebody. He gets shot down by he's in a duel with a 57 millimeter anti-aircraft battery. There were no missiles during the Korean War. We're just going against small arms and machine guns and anti-aircraft artillery. It was tough. Well, we lose a guy, and then we lose another one. And I began to wonder what's going on, because I thought, like all squadron commanders, my guys are ready. We're the best. And all of a sudden, I lose the first two guys in the air wing. And it goes on, and before it was all over, I lost 5 of the 21 pilots I had. I'm down to 16 airplanes and 16 pilots, which was fine with me from an operational point of view. They kept saying, we got to send you some replacements. I don't want any replacements. I got enough guys out here. The more we fly, the more we're involved, the better we'll be. It doesn't get on our minds, whatnot, and this is a good deal. And besides, we're making 2 or 3 landings every day that we're operating. Landing aboard carrier in a very hairy operation, maybe jet landing on those straight deck carriers. But you do it enough, it kind of gets to be routine. So we were in pretty good shape. It was going along okay. The 5 people that I lost occurred in interesting ways. One of them was just thrown in the water off the catapult. It was a pure catapult failure. We didn't have absolute safety, but aviation was never a very safe operation, but certainly not with jets in the Korean War. It just threw him in the water. The airplane, it didn't have enough power. The catapult didn't have enough power. Threw in the water. He died, drowned. He didn't get out. One of them was kind of interesting situation. He was older than I was, and he was senior to me, but he was the Air Wing Operations Officer, Charles Jones, great tennis player. We come through Honolulu, and the Royal Hawaiian would put out the word that, hey, Chuck Jones is in town, come on over and play tennis. He was a wonderful human being, just great. He had been a multi-engine pilot, flying a big patrol craft and so forth. He said, I want to go to combat. I want to fly jets. I want to do it. Okay. He gets with the Air Wing commander. They sent him up, and the Air Wing commander was a nice guy, Naval Academy class of 39. And Chuck's got to fly with somebody. He's got to fly with one of the squadrons. So the Air Wing commander comes to me and he says, how about taking Chuck aboard and making one of your 20-some guys that you have in the outfit? And I says, Jesus, I mean, at that time I knew enough about the conditioning of the mind, the psychology of combat, the psychology of the mind. He'd been trained in a system where there was no pressure. In a patrol plane, you got a lot of time to make decisions. In a jet aircraft that's going to run out of fuel in 40 minutes, you got to be right on top of it just like that. And he'd been conditioned to one. Now that we're going to bring him into another environment, which was probably the most difficult environment he could be in. Well, okay. But I says, CAG, I says, the Air Wing commander, I says, this will probably cost us at least 1 airplane. He'll bust up one somewhere along the line, at least one, and somewhere too. Okay, well, anyway, but he's a wonderful guy. So where did I put him? On my wing. I'm going to take care of this guy. And I put on the other wing the best guy in the outfit. This guy's going to take care of me. I'm going to take care of this one. And the guy in the rear end, he's going to kind of watch it all go on. But that's the way we went. Chuck was always on my way. Fast forward, the tour is about over. We have about a month before the war is ending. The Chinese are coming down. They're going to raise Cain. They want to straighten out the bomb line. Stalin had died. It was obviously going to be some kind of negotiation. The fleet commander decides that we're going to coordinate with the Air Force, 5th Air Force, and he says, I want 2 squadron commanders to go in and direct our efforts. And I got selected one of the squadron commanders. While I'm gone, I turned to this sharp guy on the left. I said, okay, his milk run here. If you get on a flight that looks like it's pretty easy target, whatnot, let him have the lead. Give him the lead of the thing. But I'll be gone. Let him have the lead. So they did it. It was a milk run up in North Korea. It's early in the flight. When you're early in the flight, in those days, early in the flight, you got a lot of fuel on board. and the aircraft are kind of underpowered. And so if you come down on a target and you try to pull out, you're going to mush. And you've got to remember that. And it kind of becomes second nature to him. Well, Chuck is leading this flight of 8 guys, and they got a target, and he's coming down on it. He's leading, and he comes down, and it's really early in the flight, and he mushes right into the ground. Some of them would bother me differently than others. There's one guy, Dick Kleinite was his name, Naval Academy class of 49, water polo player, all of that kind of stuff. And he got in a duel with a 57 millimeter. They hit him. He'd been hit before. I remember I have some pictures around of him standing on his airplane with a great big hole in the fuselage from a 57 millimeter. But anyway, he got hit. He was at altitude, got the altitude, bailed out. I'm standing on the bridge of the ship listening to the communications. It's going on maybe 30, 40 miles away. He's over the Walmado Island that was on the Sea of Japan side. But he ejected out of the airplane. He's coming down. The airplanes are circling him. He's waving to us. They were here, he's all alive. He ends up in the water, and there's about 40 knots of wind, and the parachute was dragging him, and he drowned. When you get to be a squadron commander of combat, I don't care whether you're a sergeant in the Army, the infantry, the Marine Corps, or whatnot, you're given responsibility. You're the leader, and you're not much of a leader if you don't automatically assume that you are responsible for keeping that person alive. It just becomes a very, very personal thing, and particularly if you're into combat for quite some time. Combat is an insidious thing for the leaders. I've seen admirals that were frustrated and suffering from stress. You'd never know it, but they would suffer from stress. I've seen senior officers in that situation in combat environment, but it weighs on you. It's a pressure thing, and if you're any kind of a leader at all, you do feel a personal responsibility. I lost those 5 people. Well, I could say the Congress lost them, or the president lost them. We're in this stupid war. But no, I was the commanding officer. Command. Critical word. I was the commanding officer, and I had not brought him back. The last day of the Korean War, I led a flight of 16 jet aircraft with bomb capsules underneath the wings. You pulled a wire, and out came all these leaflets. And you said, the war's over. That's what the leaflet said in Korean and English, but the war's over. So we do it. So we come back, and it's about 9 o'clock in the morning when we get back aboard after this flight. And I'm greeted with the words that, get back, and your birds were hanging bombs on them all, and you're going back for another sortie with the same 16 guys. And that just didn't really sit very well with me. I couldn't understand. I'd just been over there and said the war was over. Now I'm going back and drop a bunch of bombs. And by that time, there wasn't enough time left to protest, to go up through the chain, go through the rigmarole. The admiral that we had was like some that we had in that period of time. He had an affinity for alcohol that it kind of tempered his judgment. So he was useless. There was no way to go into him, and that was out. So I said, don't worry about it. I said, 8 guys off each squadron to the board. I said, just follow me, and when I say drop, drop. So we took off with the 16 birds, 4 little 100-pound bombs under each wing of each one, 64 100-pounder. I found the most desolate mountaintop I could find. We cruised down the top of it, pickled them off one at a time until all 64 were gone. All of them were armed. Now, that's the only time that I ever disobeyed an order, but I would do it again and again. Sometimes just stupid. But that whole last phase of that Korean War was something that really, really could get to you, and it bothered you. I came back, I was really down. I blew in front of the Admiral. He had me up for dinner and whatnot, and one night with one of his friends, and I really let loose. I'm a lieutenant commander. He's a seasoned old rear admiral. He's 20 years my senior, but we were good friends, and he tolerated it. But I just blew. I really blew about it. I was just so frustrated at how this nation could get into that kind of a war. The rules of engagement that were imposed and so forth, just unbelievable. And it was not good. One of the things I did do was, which is part of combat, and you hear it all the time, I got in my little old jet aircraft before I turned over the squadron to somebody else. I got in my aircraft and I went and called on the families, the dependents, sometimes wife, children, whatever, of all of the 5 guys I lost. And I remember one that's really sad up in Seattle. Mother, she was a widow herself, her only son was in my squadron. I'd lost him. And we sat on a park bench in Seattle. It was a nice day. Sat there, and she just held my hand for a whole hour. The tears. It's called closure. It's called closure. And that was closure. Hey, the Korean War, what a mess. What a mess. That was the start of other messes. Having been in World War II, seen all of that, how we came out of that, and then to be involved in the Korean War, that was a transition to something that was not good. It led to Vietnam, which was even worse.
This 86 is just returning from a combat mission up in North Korea, what is known as Bengali. It's piloted by Francis Sobreski, commanding officer of the 51st Fighter Wing. Colonel Sobreski is one of the leading agents in the United States, and in just a moment we'll move in closer and see what the Colonel has to report about this mission he's just returned from. Pretty well, thank you, Sergeant High, but the same old story. Well, we encountered the same number, about 100 up. There were only about 20 of us. They're always about 5 to 1. Everyone did very well. I believe that one of the boys damaged one this afternoon. However, I didn't even get to fire my guns for that matter. But they were there for the last month or so. Expect to run into them every time. The airplane is in fine shape. Guys, it's the finest operating aircraft that I've ever been in. You've been doing a terrific job here, and I'm sure that all the rest of the men within the organization have been doing a terrific job. They've been working awful long hours. Pilots in general have been doing an outstanding job out in the front line. However, the only thing we expect right now is just a little bit more cooperation. People back home, I guess. I'm sure that we're getting plenty of that. I think so. It's pretty rough here. We get quite a few orders. We'll get it. Well, as long as we keep working together as a team, we hope that within a short period of time that we can bring all this mess to an end. We'll do it. So you keep flying, we'll keep in the air. Well, you've certainly been doing a terrific job, Jack. I feel that the people in the States are very much aware of the effort that you and the officers here have put into this war, and I hope that with their full-hearted support and assistance, within the near future, we will have this thing pretty well buttoned up. I'm glad to hear that, Harold. Quite a few hours we're putting in here nights.
That's right. As I recall, many of you people worked right on through the night, right into 2 o'clock in the morning. You get about 6 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours sleep, and you're back on the job again.
Right, sir.
It's highly commendable. The aircraft's in fine shape, Sergeant. Everything performs beautifully. The instruments are all working fine, and the airplane has an awful lot of thrust. I believe it's one of the fastest little airplanes that I've flown.
Glad to hear that.
See all sign on the dotted line here. Name, rank, serial number, and time, right?
That's right.
Well, this is about the average mission. Let's see.
I'm glad to hear it.
About an hour 25, hour 30 minutes.
Shit.
Certainly covering an awful lot of territory in about an hour 20 minutes.
Well, you do it. A lot more of the old style.
That's right. Thank you very much. You're ready to go on the next one.
The Navy's first ace was Naval Aviator number 85, David Ingalls, in 1918. Flying a British Sopwith Camel for the RAF, he shot down 5 German airplanes in 6 weeks. Plane design and production proceeded unstopped for the next 20 years, and by World War II, naval aviation had become a power to defend our way of life, particularly in the Pacific Theater, after the surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Just 4 months later, in April 1942, Jimmy Doolittle led 16 Army Air Corps B-25 bombers from the Navy carrier Hornet in a daring raid. They accurately and successfully bombed targets in Japan that sent a strong message to the Japanese leadership. The message: you made a huge mistake bombing America. Navy planes dominated in the Pacific War. Fighters, the Grumman Cat series, the Wildcat, the Bearcat, the Tiger Cat, and the Hellcat. Hellcat pilots shot down over 5,000 Japanese airplanes in the Pacific. And the Helldiver that replaced the Dauntless. There were PBYs and the Kingfisher spotter and rescue planes, and of course, the 400-mile-per-hour Corsair. The Corsair was one of the most successful fighter planes of World War II, and very effective later in the Korean War. Most of its fighting in World War II was in the Pacific Theater against the Japanese. The Navy flew the Corsair from aircraft carriers, the Marines from island airfields. It was an air-to-air fighter, it was a ground attack aircraft, and escorted on bomber missions, protecting them from Japanese fighters. The Japanese called it whistling death because of a distinctive sound the Corsair made at high speeds.
It is newly painted in honor of U.S. Naval Aviator Charles Joseph Obie O'Brien. Growing up building models, Hanging out the airport and devouring aviation books and magazines, Obie took to the skies at 9 years of age in a Ford Trimotor in 1937. Flying was in his blood. In 1946, while Obie graduated from prep school, the Navy started a new program for potential pilots, known as the Naval Aviation College Program. Passing all the necessary exams, he was eligible to attend a college with a Naval ROTC program. He enrolled in Villanova College and was also sworn into the Navy on July 18, 1946, as a V-5 apprentice seaman. After spending the required 2 years in college, Obie reported to Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida, where he trained in the SNJ and Hellcat. He earned his gold wings in June of 1950. Upon graduation, he reported for duty with Jet Training Unit 1 at Whiting Field, where he logged time in the Lockheed T-01, the Navy's designation for the F-80C Shooting Star. Completing his jet training, Obie was assigned to a Corsair unit. As he says, go figure. Obie has over 7,000 flight hours in 52 types of aircraft and 735 arrested landings on 20 different carriers. He also held the honor of being the only pilot in the world actively flying the Corsair, like he flew in combat until he retired in 2013 at the young age of 85.
359 was my airplane. It had my name on it, and I liked it. Of course, I flew it 3 times in combat. It's been well taken care of. It's had 6 or 7 owners in the last 60 years, and it's just like a brand new airplane. When I got in it, a lot of nostalgia. Some of the instruments I didn't recognize because when I flew it, it was pretty basic. But the airplane smelled just the same. I certainly appreciate the past owner and the present owners taking care of my airplane. Ever since I was a little toddler, about 5 years old, I was interested in airplanes. We were vacationing in Ocean City, New Jersey. Fortunately, there was an airport very close to us. And I would go down there on my bike and hang around and talk to the people. And I saw a sign that says there's going to be a tri-motor Ford airplane here next week. And you can get a ride on one. So I thought that was a good idea. And the price for me would be $2.50. $2.50. I was only 9 years old. This is 1937. $2.50. I was a paper boy, and I got a penny a paper. So that was 250 papers I had to deliver to get that ride. So I went down there, and I got onto the airplane. We had about a 15-minute ride, and I came back. I had not asked my parents whether it was okay or not because I figured that permission would be very hard, impossible to get, and forgiveness might be a little bit easier. So I took my ride, and then when I came home, I told my mother what I had done, and she was very, very unhappy. And I told her how sorry I was, but I got a good ride. My father just kind of smiled. That was the last ride I had until I joined the Navy and started Navy flight training. But that cemented my desire to fly. There is no doubt that what I was going to do later in life. I graduated from high school in 1946. In 1946, everybody in the Navy was, all the pilots, everybody was getting out and going back to school. The Navy saw that there would be a valley of lack of pilots during those years, and so they started a one-year program, which would, if you could qualify, get yourself into an ROTC college, pass all the aviation the physical and the mental, pass the interviews, they would let you enlist as an apprentice seaman, send you to school for 2 years. I went to Villanova, by the way, for 2 years, $50 a month on books and tuition. And then following that, you would go to Pensacola, be sworn in as a midshipman, and go through flight training. I went to Pensacola in 1948, took basic flight training in the SNJ, qualified on the carrier in the SNJ, went down to Corpus Christi for advanced training, flew the Hellcat, the S6F, went through that training, qualified on the carrier in the S6F, and got my wings in June of 1950. In 1950, I was assigned to take jet training. The Navy had some F-80s, we called them TO-1s, single-seat jet, and it was only a month course, 25 hours, and I went through that and enjoyed flying the jet. It was a new experience for me after flying the SNJ and the S6. My first flight, I had never been in a tricycle landing gear. I had never been in any kind of a jet, even a commercial jet. And so it was quite a thrill to sit there, be able to see the runway clearly, and add the power and take off. It was quite a thrill. After completing the jet training, I went to talk to my detailer, and he said, the Korean War had started, and they were starting a couple of squadrons down in Jacksonville, Florida. It was 4 Corsair squadrons, and they needed pilots. So guess where I was going? I was going to Jacksonville and fly Corsairs, which I had mixed feelings about. I would like to fly the Corsair, but I also would have liked to flown jets. But in the end, I think the best thing that ever happened to me really was to be assigned to Corsairs. I made 2 med cruises in the Corsair, flying the F4U-5, the first cruise, the F4U-4, the second cruise, and then we went to Korea flying the F4U-4. The skipper called us into an all-pilots meeting and said, guess where we're going, guys? Because everybody really was anxious to do our share. The West Coast pilots were flying, and we were going into med. We thought maybe we should be doing our share of the fighting. So we left Mayport, Florida, on the Lake Champlain, which is a Essex-type carrier, straight deck, of course, and went through the Med, through the Suez, and into Korea. We flew a line period from the Lake Champlain and cross-decked over to the USS Boxer, and they sent a jet squadron over to the Lake Champlain. It had something to do with the fuel capacity of the ships. On my first launch, we briefed in the ready room for a strike on a bridge. The bomb load was going to be a 1,000-pound bomb and 250 bombs and six loaded 50 caliber machine guns. We briefed very carefully the launch of four Corsairs. I was number 4. Went out to the airplane. At that time, I remember being a 25-year-old bachelor, hot to trot, ready to go out and break something. Really. So when I got in the airplane, you would taxi up to the deck launch officer. He would give you the wind-up signal after you gave him a thumbs up that your instruments were okay. You would add as much power as you could until you felt the tail just getting very light. When he gave you the signal to go, you would add full power, and that big 13-foot prop, a lot of torque, so you needed a lot of right rudder. And went off the deck. The ship would be making some of its own wind, at least 32, maybe 35 knots. You were too heavy for the natural wind in the ships. they would download you a little bit. But that didn't happen very often. In any case, when you went off the end of the deck, you would settle just a little bit. You would get your wheels up as fast as you could, get a little bit of speed, raise those flaps gently, and turn off. The flight that we had was on a bridge in North Korea, and it was heavily dependent on both ends. I think there was also railroad tracks on it. We climbed up to 8,000 feet, saw the target, and we made individual runs. The leader went down, number 2, number 3, and number 4, which was me. By the time I got started in my run, there was pretty heavy anti-aircraft fire. And I thought, oh boy. And coming down, I could see these orange, they look like tennis balls coming up at me. And I thought, and I could hear them as they went by the airplane go, woof, woof. And then I thought to myself, I'm seeing only about a sixth of the ammunition being placed. But anyway, we would drop our bombs at about 3,000, the big bomb about 3,000 feet, and then we made 2 more passes to get rid of the other 2 bombs. And with each pass, it seemed like those tennis balls, those red tennis balls, I call them, were getting closer and closer and more. In any case, when I got back to the ship, nobody was hit. It was a good flight, and we did significant damage to the bridge. We came back, came around, we all got aboard safely, and when I got out, then I got scared. I was not scared I was concerned, but I wasn't scared until I got back in the ready room and said, oh boy, that was hairy. We flew both, I think, of the 24 missions, I flew 11 close air supports missions. The rest were strikes. And when we couldn't do a strike, we would be set free to do what we called road recce. And anything in North Korea was moving, wheeled, we would shoot at.
Okay.
On one occasion, I got 2 boxcars, which was good.
Okay. Did you always fly number 4, or did you move up to an element lead
No.
or flight lead?
I was mostly number 4. I was only an ensign.
And you were one of the young guys in the squad.
I was one of the young guys in the squadron. And we flew in sections, the leader and his wingman, and then the section leader, which were the last 2 airplanes. And that would be a more senior officer than an ensign or a JG. But that was my spot, which I liked. And I would try to, when we were making a run, I would kind of get off to the side a little bit or come in at a slightly different angle, because I knew that they had warsighted those first 3 airplanes, and I wanted to not be in the same flight path. The missions that I liked more than the strikes were close air support. And the way that worked is after you would launch from the ship, they would shift you to a unit called Red Crown, which coordinated all the close air support missions. If somebody needed close air support, they would go to Red Crown, and then they would assign you a mission. I liked those missions because we could get down low. We knew that we were helping our troops. And that was very rewarding, and it was especially rewarding when you got a message from the ground that, attaboy, and that was really good. We were controlled a lot of the times by an Air Force Mosquito, SNJ, and he would mark a target for us, and he would tell us what the results of our mission were. And I enjoyed that because I felt I was really doing something to help people. And when I got an attaboy, that made me feel great. They would mark the target sometimes. Okay, I'm going to put out a red rocket. That's the target. Your target is so many feet from that. Okay, I see the red smoke, but then I look around and I see red smoke, red smoke, red smoke. Those rascals were listening to us, and it was clever. They had those things set. I guess they could do it by remote control, but it would, if you didn't know where the original smoke was, and you just came in, you wouldn't know what you were supposed to do. Yeah, I was flying missions, and when the war was over, instead of bombing, we would go out and fly our mission on the last day. Instead of going down, getting low and dropping the bomb, we did what I called dip bombing. You would fly along, drop the nose a little bit, drop your bombs, and get out of there. Nobody wanted to be the last one shot down. 359 was my airplane. It had my name on it, and I liked it. Of course, I flew it down in Jacksonville, and I flew it 3 times in combat. It was a good airplane. I liked it very much. And on the way home from Korea, came back through the Med, and the Navy told us to drop off 2 of our Corsairs in Port Leahy. I volunteered, since my airplane was going to be one of the put in the pool status. I volunteered to take it to Port Leahy, and I flew it over there, and with the other guy, and we parked the airplanes, and we were brought immediately back to the ship as soon as we transferred the airplanes. That was the last time I saw that airplane until a couple of years ago. I found that airplane was still flying, and it was in California. Okay, after we got back to Jacksonville with BF-44, we traded in our Corsairs for Banshees, the McDonnell twin-engine jet. So I finally got to jets. A little bit late, but I got to them. I flew them for the next 10 months when I got orders to Pensacola to be an instructor. I was an instructor in Pensacola flying the SNJ, and from there I went to photo reconnaissance school, and came back to Jacksonville in the Photo Crusader. The Photo Crusader was just like the fighter, except it didn't have any armament. It didn't have any guns. It was unarmed. Every carrier had 3 of those Crusaders on it. We did the same thing that the satellites do now. I made 3 cruisers in the Crusader, and our squadron motto was alone, because we flew alone. We were unarmed, because we were unarmed, and we were unafraid. And I always figured 2 out of 3 is not too bad. After leaving the Crusaders, which was a fine airplane, it was the 2nd best airplane I've ever flown. The Corsair was the best, and the Crusader was 2nd best. I got orders to New York recruit aviation orientated officers. That would be the AOC, the crewmen, and the pilots. I did that for 15 months, went to the postgraduate school, finally got my degree, and then went to the USS Bonhomme Richard as the assistant air officer. The assistant air officer is the air officer in charge of all aircraft movements within about 3 miles of the ship and everything on the deck. Spent 15 months there, and then came back to Norfolk. And here I was assigned to a staff, Commander Fleet Air Norfolk, which had air stations and all the fleet airplanes aboard. I was operations officer there. And then I got orders to be 7th Fleet representative, 7th Fleet liaison in Saigon to everybody in Saigon. I was like the go-to guy for carrier questions. I spent 14 months there. I came back to Norfolk and finished out my tours as operations officer of Naval Air Station Norfolk. Meantime, I got attached. I found out there was a group in New York called the Sky Typers. They were flying SNJs, 5 SNJs, 10,000 feet. Center one had a fly line abreast. The center one had a computer in it, which triggers smoke on all 5 airplanes, which led a dot matrix message across the sky. And that was a lot of fun. I flew with them for 24 years, 24 air show seasons. The fighter factory over in Suffolk had some nice airplanes, and they were going to build a museum is where we are. And they had the Corsair, they had a TBM, and they had a Sky Raider and a lot of other airplanes, the Mosquito. And so I wrote a very nice letter and told the Sky Typers I found a better deal, so I was going to fly with them. To get into flying the museum, I had plenty of flight time. I had heavy time, and they were looking for a couple pilots, particularly SNJ pilot. So I started flying the fighter factory's SNJ, and then they got the Corsair. And since I had a lot of Corsair time, I got checked out in the Corsair. And since I was checked out in the Corsair, I thought maybe I should check out in their TBM. And when I checked out in the TBM, I thought maybe I ought to check out in the AD, and I did, plus all the other airplanes. And then they built the Military Aviation Museum here in Virginia Beach, and we moved from Suffolk, from the fighter factory, moved everything over here. The surprise that you had for me was that my Corsair 412 359 was flying in California, belonged to a gentleman out there. And my friend Steve contacted him, and he said if he's qualified in a Corsair, he's more than welcome to come fly his old mount. And over the course of 2 years, there was delayed, and finally we set a date, and we went out to California, to Ramona, near San Diego, and I was fortunate enough to fly my old Corsair that I had left in Port Leote 59 years ago. The last time I saw the airplane in Port Leote, it had been well worn. It was tired. It had been at sea for 8 months, combat in three or 4 months, and it was needed a paint job. When I saw it in Ramona, they opened the hangar doors, and I saw a beautiful plane, just like it was off the line. It was shiny, it was painted up very nice. It had Jesse Brown's name on one side. He was shot down in Korea. And on the other side was Hudner's name. Tom Hudner was a pilot who landed next to Jesse Brown in an unsuccessful effort to save him. Hudner was later on presented with the Congressional Medal of Honor for that action. Unfortunately, Jesse Brown was not recovered. No, I thought about the people who had flown that airplane. In addition to myself, they were all retired or passed on, and all the fun we used to have in the squadron, and it just brought back memories of nice times and nice people, and times that I relish.
And I took a photo of you sitting in an easy chair with a bottle of cold water, and I remember the airplane was parked right in front of the hangar, and you were staring at it. It seemed like
Yeah,
you were a million miles away.
I was. I was a million miles and 60 years away. I got a call from you, Steve, about 2 months ago, maybe 3, and you mentioned to me that my airplane was no longer in California, but it was in Florida. And the owner, the new owner, wanted to paint it in its original colors from VF-44, and with my number 412 on it, and the squadron designations, the F on the tail, and the yellow wingtips and rudder, top rudder, and that's great. They're going to put your name on the airplane, and I was ecstatic. I understand that it was in the Baba Black Sheep series. It was in the Reno Air Races, and it's just like a brand new airplane. When I got in it, a lot of nostalgia. Some of the instruments I didn't recognize because when I flew it, it was pretty basic, but the airplane smelled just the same. So I certainly appreciate the past owner and the present owners taking care of my airplane.
The last and possibly the greatest propeller-driven fighter aircraft was the Vought F-4U Corsair 1. With their bent wings, the Corsairs are instantly recognizable, but the full extent of their capability is generally not as well recognized as that of other more famous types. However, the F-4U could not only outfight the best of the Axis fighters, but also those on the Allied side. They were powerful, fast, well-armed, strong, and reliable. Ideal fighters. At the end of the war, orders for most aircraft types were cancelled, but the F-4U remained at the heart of the busy development and production program. For those who like to argue the relative merits of World War II fighters, this continued development indicates the high regard in which it was held by the U.S. Navy and Marine. The Corsair not only continued in production and use into the jet age, but in Korea they encountered jet fighters in combat, and the outcome was not always to the jet's liking. The F-4U's peculiar wing reflects the nature of the team that designed it. Vought engineers have often resorted to the unconventional where it worked, perhaps reflecting the age of the company. Founded in June of 1917. Back in those days, intuition was as reliable as science in aircraft design, and Vought has never been in the habit of dismissing the unusual too hastily. Over the years, the company has made a tremendous contribution to aviation in general, and in particular, to United States Naval Air. The first aircraft to take off from the deck of the U.S. Navy's original aircraft carrier, the Langley, on October 17, 1922, was a Vought plane, a VE-7. This was only one of a number of such historic events for the company. Earlier, the E-7s had equipped the Navy's first 2 fighter squadrons. The relationship between the Navy and the company has persevered to the benefit of both. The company's founder was Chance Milton Vaught, born in New York on the 26th of February, 1890. His father built sailing ships for a living, but the young man turned away from the sea after completing his mechanical engineering studies, and in 1910 started his association with flying machines. Chance Vaught died young in 1930, but by then he had built a thriving enterprise that has survived several moves around the U.S. as well as changes of ownership and management. The company's reputation for outstanding aircraft stretches back to their earliest design, and the F4U was to continue this tradition. The company's first plane was built in a third-floor room of a disused ladies' stocking factory. It was lowered to the street in sections out of the windows and then reassembled so the engine could be tested with the plane tethered to a telephone pole. Despite this unusual birth, it was a very successful design. The plane was the VE-7, VE for Vogue Experimental, and 7 because it was Chance Vaught's 7th design. It was modestly described as a two-seat advanced train, but its reception by Army pilots in February 1918 was so favorable that it was ordered into mass production as a fight. After the war's end, some production of the VE-7 continued, including the first orders for the Navy. Several versions found their way into Navy use. There were twin-seat observation and foc planes and the single-seat fighters. Vaught's next plane, the VE-8, was similar to the VE-7 in many respects. The company drew from the VE-7 in different ways, and the VE-7 family were produced into the 1930s, though not as a thing. Vaught continued to work on fighter designs, but to little avail. These aircraft were very impressive and included the company's first all-metal plane. However, there were failures in the marketplace, and Vaught was only kept alive by its successful sales of other aircraft, including a succession of observation planes called the Corsairs. This is a name that has become very closely associated with Vaught. Through the 20s and even the 30s, the Vaught company quietly prospered. It was small and sometimes struggled to meet orders, but it continued to have successful designs under production. These included the Vindicator light bomber and the Kingfisher catapult plane, but a successful fighter design continued to elude them. The V-141 was a spectacular failure. Two test versions under evaluation by the Army and Navy in 1935 had disappeared without a trace. The plane had appallings in recovery, and despite the best efforts of the Vaught men, it remained dangerous. Renamed the V-143 after stretching, being given a new tail, it still failed to impress any buyer. Meanwhile, in 1936, the company's chief engineer, Rex Weizsäcker, had commenced work on another fighter for the Navy. The design was completed and submitted in 1938. This would be the firm's 6th fighter submission and the first one to be successful. Within the company, it was referred to as the V-166, but it was accepted for testing as the XF-4U. Weizsäcker had devised the smallest practical aircraft around a Pratt & Whitney project for a gigantic supercharged double WASP radial engine that would deliver 1,800 horsepower. At the time, this was the world's most powerful engine.
Generally, it takes about 4 years to develop an aircraft engine from the time you start the design to the time it goes into production. So it was 2.5 years before we flew the engine in the Corsair. We flew an experimental engine. which then had a rating somewhere around 16 or 1700 horsepower. Our experience with the engine in the early flying was quite good. We couldn't get the airplane to altitude because the fuel system vaporized at the higher altitude, but we were able to fly effectively at sea level and up to 20,000 feet or so. The early airplane did so well, in fact, that after a rather limited number of flights, it was flown over a speed course, and it made a speed of 405 miles an hour. This was the fastest that any military airplane had flown up to this time, and that made quite a big impression. This particular flight had an effect far beyond the Corsair program, as a matter of fact, because in the late 1930s, there was a technical debate in the aircraft industry of whether future engines should be air-cooled or liquid-cooled. The air-cooled engines were lighter and simpler and less vulnerable to battle damage. But the liquid-cooled engines were supposed to have a lower drag. So the military were leaning very much in the direction of liquid-cooled engines. Finally, in late 1937, just after the R-2800 was started, they came to Pratt & Whitney and said, this is the Army Air Corps, not the Navy. The Army Air Corps came to Pratt & Whitney and said, we're not going to buy any more air-cooled engines from you. Well, that was a tremendous blow, and it was a blow to the R-2800 program at that time. Pratt & Whitney regrouped and started the design of a very large, complicated liquid-cooled engine, which they had no real interest in. Well, they continued the R-2800, but on a lower rate than they should have, until this Corsair flight. And then they invited Hap Arnold, who was, at that time, the chief of the Army Air Corps, in, told him about the Corsair flight, showed him the R-2800 engine, and he says, forget the liquid-cooled engines, and then drive on. So actually, the 2800 powered 3 of our fighters in the war. It powered the Corsair and the Hellcat and the Thunderbolt, whereas the liquid-cooled engines, the Rolls-Royce engine powered the P-51, and the Allison engine powered the Lockheed Lightning. One of the interesting and novel features of the power plant system on the Corsair was the combat power system. Normally, an air-cooled engine is limited really by cooling rather than by mechanical strength. It's usually possible to make something a little stronger, but the cooling is a definite limitation. So at high power, these engines were actually cooled partially by air and partially by fuel. The engine was enriched so that some of the fuel wasn't actually burned effectively. It just went through the engine to cool it. Several years before the war, a couple of engineers at Pratt & Whitney had patented a water injection system to get more power out of the engine by cooling the cylinder with water. Nothing was done about it at the time because the water and fuel consumption was so high that it really wasn't practical to use it for more than 5 minutes or so. However, during the war, it was proposed that this would be all right because combat pilots, 5 minutes would mean an awful lot to them. So Pratt & Whitney developed this combat power system. And what it consisted of was a system with a pump and a tank which added water to the cylinder. When the pilot advanced the throttle beyond a certain gate, it also leaned out the mixture and permitted the engine to be operated at a higher manifold pressure. My good friend and test pilot Boone Guyton did the early flying on this. Very dangerous and challenging work because the engine was operated right up to the limits. All of us who stayed on the ground owed a tremendous debt to Boone and his men because we were completely dependent on them to get the information in flight that we needed to make the engine work. Well, he took the thing up there, and we had a very major engine failure, which resulted in some big problems for Boone. Fortunately, he got through it all right. That particular system gave over 20% increase in power, and the combat pilots loved it. Boone and his group there risked their neck every day to make this airplane a success, and all of us owe them a lot.
It would be over 4 years after the first test order before the first production plane was delivered. Those 4 years, Europe had slid into a war. On the 1st of October 1940, the original X-plane became the first U.S. fighter to fly at over 400 miles per hour in level flight. This not only justified faith in the radial engine, but it confirmed for the Navy that this was the plane needed to fill the role of carrier fighter. The Vought Company was affiliated with Sikorsky under the umbrella of the United Aircraft Corporation. The Corsair's power plant was a twin-row 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine, with an initial bore of 5 3/4 inches and stroke of 6 inches. By the end of the war, Pratt & Whitney engines were being produced at over 30 plants in the USA. 26 of these were within the company's control, and 6 other companies were producing the engines on a nominal wartime license fee. The F-4U was designed to be a brutally effective fighter, but it was not an easy airplane to land, a point of concern that led to delays in its full acceptance into service. The F-4U was designed from the outset as a carrier fighter, and as a result, much consideration had gone into making its landing gear as strong as possible. A huge propeller demanded a lot of ground clearance. This would have meant a very high landing gear. The inverted gull wings were specifically designed to compensate. An unconventional wing was no obstacle to the Vought team. A fighter needed as much power as possible, and if this could be best delivered with a strange wing, then so be it. The cockpit was pushed a long way back down the fuselage, and visibility in landing was restricted. The landing gear would be taking stresses above the norm, and the pilots would be concentrating more than was necessary with other types. Despite impressively successful trials, the Navy was reluctant to commit its carriers to the Corsair's protection. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, much more conventionally, was preferred. Though designed as a carrier plane, first U.S. Corsairs were restricted to land-based service with the Marine. The airstrip on Guadalcanal, renamed Henderson Field, was completed and turned into a major asset in the continuing fighting in the Solomon Islands. Steel matting stabilized the surface and made operations safe. Green settled him to a long occupation. When the Japanese gave up their attempts to evict the Marines from Guadalcanal in January 1943, they had already suffered severe losses. However, Japan continued to deploy strong forces. At that time, they still had planes that outclassed their American opponents. Soon, the first Corsairs arrived in the theater to play their part. The Marines were well aware of the reservations about the Corsair, and initially approached their new planes with caution. This evaporated quickly, as the experience of flying the F-4U convinced the pilots that the machines were not. Marine pilots were soon proudly asserting that they were flying the best fighter in the world. Eventually, their voices would be heard. On the 12th of February 1943, Corsair's combat career opened with the arrival of a squadron at Henderson Field. But next day, they escorted bombers to Bogan, a mission that had previously been out of the question because of the short range of the available flight. Typical of the wartime marine bases, conditions at Henderson remained fairly limited, with most servicing being carried out in the open or in tents. The corsairs were maintained and armed, refueled, and turned around fast. As both shield and aggressive forces, they had to be constantly obeyed. The 1st Squadron on Guadalcanal, VMF 124, established the Corsair as a success. In their tour of duty, they shot down 68 Japanese primes against losses of 11 Corsairs and 3 pilots. The squadron provided the first F-4U ace, Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, who downed his 5th plane on the 13th of May. Walsh went on to have 21 combat victories confirmed. The Corsairs were now being produced in large numbers, and the enthusiastic Marines welcomed them. The F-4Us played very little part in the European theater. In contrast to the fragility of the Japanese planes, the F-4U was built taut. The huge engine provided power to handle the weight of the arm. In the hands of the Marines, the Corsairs built up a formidable reputation in air-to-air combat. The Japanese recognized the significance of the Corsairs aright. They have lost the superiority they had enjoyed with the Zero, and they would have little chance to reclaim it. Victory rolls and swoops above Corsair bases were frequent, as pilots celebrated their successes. 9,441 F-4U-1s were produced. This number included several subtypes and numerous modifications. Altogether, 500 major engineering changes and over 2,500 minor alterations were made during the production of the F-4U-1s. Corsairs were to be used by several countries during the war. In particular, well over 2,000 were obtained by the British for use with their fleet air arm. In contrast to the U.S. Navy, the English were quick to seize upon the potency of the plane. Whether it had ideal landing characteristics was secondary to its demonstrable power. Accordingly, they deployed the Corsair to their carriers. The British enthusiasm was to have a strongly persuasive effect when the U.S. Navy came to reconsider the Corsair for its carriers. The British had been pioneers in carrier aviation and had been very influential in its development. British experimentation and theorizing had led the way. Their opinions were treated with respect. In spite of their stained reputation, the British were often highly adventurous. Reducing the concept of a floating runway with the bare minimum is indicative of it. They were soon flying them from as many as ordinary, after cutting 8 inches off the wings to make them fit below decks. The British did not have an easy time of it at first. The pilot seat was too low, and this, combined with being so far back, meant that the pilot had very poor visibility. In addition, the undercarriage had too much bounce. These were the very factors that influenced the U.S. Navy to reject the plane for carrying. The British persisted in carrier trial. Later modifications to raise the pilot seat and stiffen the landing gear further reduced for viscount. In April 1944, Reacting to the British experience and the enthusiasm of Marine pilots, the U.S. Navy began a new series of Corsair trials. The success of these trials eventually worked to reverse the earlier decision. The FOU was cleared for carrier service. These were Marine pilots with Corsair experience who had been redeployed to fly from the USS Essex. The Corsairs were simply the most formidable fighter aircraft available, and the Navy had great need for them. The fury of kamikaze attacks that had started in the Philippines would continue to the end of the war, and the Corsairs, as interceptors, were the best available forward defenders.
The first time I saw the XF4U-1, the predecessor of the production Corsair, was in the mock-up stage. It sat down behind some curtains in the experimental hangar, and I was fascinated. I'd just come out of the Navy, and we had been flying much slower and smaller aircraft. This airplane was tremendous in size. The cockpit was large, and it was unique by those very graceful gull wings, inverted gull wings, if you will, and by the smoothness of the fuselage. I thought it was a tremendous airplane, and I had an immediate desire to want to fly it. I guess any pilot would. I was awareness of my luck in flying the Corsair on the first takeoff of the airplane. I started flying it about the 9th flight after Lyman Bullard made the early flights, got the engine squared away. And the whole flight produced a mixture of awe and just an awareness of what a tremendous design the engineering team at Vought had produced. It was a magnificent airplane, and I immediately simply fell in love with it, literally. And I wanted to continue flying this airplane. It was not just incomparable to any speed or climbing ability or firepower airplane that I had ever seen in the fleet. It had many, because of its unique wing structure and largeness and long nose, it had many sobriquets. I call it Baby. The other nicknames it had were immediate, and they were forthcoming okay. One, of course, was Old Bent Wings, and that was because it had those inverted gull wings. For instance, the Marines, during the Western Pacific operation, in the latter days, were using the airplane almost exclusively as a dive bomber and a close air support airplane, as well as a fighter and interceptor of Zeros and kamikazes. They called it the Sweetheart of Okinawa. Then, of course, the last one was what I named the book that I just completed on the airplane, Whistling Death. Whistling Death came from the Japanese because the airplane made an extremely high whistling scream sound as it came over, as it passed over. And you could always tell it. It was a signature. The airplane had begun already to down Japanese Zeros at a high rate. And so its fame was known along with this sound, and the Japanese decided they'd call it Whistling Death. And that's why the name of the book. Vaught's design team, a great group, came up with innovations to match the advanced power and speed of this airplane. It was a giant step. It was pushing the state of the art, if you will. We started out with an experimental R2800 engine, a double wasp. This went on to the production engine, and we carried the whole power plant system along with the new airplane. So we were pushing the state of the art, and the advanced concepts that had to come along required innovations and a look into the future and a try We don't gain much by staying with the true and the tried if we're going to advance. So Vought did this. One of the problems with our airplane was, in its early stages, was in establishing the power plant system, which was new, with the airplane as a good integral part and a working operation that a fellow named Don Jordan started to take on as a task. I met Don early on and began to learn about power plants. The engine, this large double wasp, and its high performance required infinite amounts of tests. And nearly every time it got to be almost laughable, but nearly every time I went up, old Don Jordan wanted some type of test. We could perform them on the way and doing stall tests or other things, and it wasn't really that great a chore. But I became very friendly with this person who was extremely knowledgeable about engines. I learned from him so much in the course of these discussions, and he was always pleasant to deal with, that I had no problem in understanding what I was supposed to do with the airplane. If the engine went sour, it wasn't Don Jordan's fault. It was because we were pushing it right to the edge of the envelope.
When the Athlor Yuns entered Farrier service in the lead up to the Okinawa invasion, their primary mission was the protection of the Allied task forces from the growing menace of kamikaze attacks. Kamikazes confirmed the fears of the U.S. about Vietnamese fanaticism. Japanese soldiers have stopped their American opponents in fighting to the last man. Japanese sailors had spun away from ships trying to rescue them in shark-infested waters. Now, from the death throes of the embryo, young men were flying their aircraft as guided bombs to crash into Allied ships. Despite their ferocity, the kamikaze attacks didn't dwarf that. Even as 90% of an attacking force were shot down, a remaining 10% was still potentially lethal. The only ships relatively impervious to the raids were the battleships and some of the British carriers on their decks. The Corsairs' arrival on the carriers coincided with a crescendo of kamikaze missions. Around Okinawa, the Japanese defiantly threw in massed raids as well as the normal smaller. 10 massed attacks totaled some 1,500 sorties out of a total of around 3,000 attacks in 3 months. Over 400 ships were hit. This works out at around 1 strike for every 8 aircraft lost. If the Japanese had not run out of aircraft first, they would eventually have run out of volunteers. Despite the success of the Corsairs in intercepting the incoming attacks, the kamikazes still got through in significant numbers. With F-4Us now flying from all carrier task groups, some Corsairs also burned in the kamikaze frames. The best place for a burning plane is somewhere astern, underwater. Damage and fire control became the finely honed skills of professionals in the course of the war.
The first time that I flew the Corsair was on the island of Espiritu Santo. Major Bill Geist came in with the first Corsair outfit into the Solomon Islands, and I just couldn't wait to get into this airplane because I'd heard all the great things about it. And I have to tell you this, that it was like stepping from a Model T into a Cadillac. I'd been flying the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. In fact, all my aerial combat was in that airplane. And then to get into this airplane was a great change. And while I was up working it out, it was a birdcage model. It had the oddball canopy, so to speak. The aerial came off, and the stick that stuck up there for the aerial, that's all the damage I did to it. And I came in, made a perfect landing with the thing, and that was with the short shank on the tail wheel. which gave a lot of pilots a lot of trouble later because it had a tendency to want to ground loop on some of the old boys. So that tail wheel shank was extended and made it a lot easier to land. The thing I liked about the airplane was, of course, the comfort of the cockpit, and the fact that it went faster, was a lot quieter than the plane that I had been flying. I just loved this airplane. It was just a great airplane to dive bomb with, easy to get on the target and stay on the target with. And all I could say about it was an outstanding performer. I remember back with the old biplane, the old F-4B-4, the old Boeing. That was my first fighter, of course, and I can remember guys, just, oh, that's a ground looping SOB, ground looping my foot. That thing just, if you knew how to handle it, you right down that runway straight, you had no problem with the thing. On our new lieutenants that were coming in there at Goleta, we just gave them the manual and went over the thing step by step and did give them systematic checkout. And we didn't have any problems at all there with ground looping or any other problem on getting the plane off and on. See, the reason that the shank was, maybe I'm using the wrong term, on the tail was lengthened on the tail wheel was so that the plane came up and didn't, these wings that have the bend didn't blank out the tail, so that you would come in and make more of a flat landing in place of this. And it did make a big difference for somebody just checking out in it. It took away the tendency to wander at one point as the tail dropped. And so all I can say is that it was not a difficult airplane to fly. It was a great airplane from start to finish. The firepower happened to be the 650 calibers. And of course, that's, to me, is the greatest gun that was ever built. They worked great, and when you hit something, they ended the career of that plane or ground target, whatever it was. It was vicious. And you've heard a lot of wild stories where it sort of stopped the airplane. Well, that's a crock. The airplane just moved right on through. You never had any problem at all when you were firing the 650s.
The end of the war coincided with a critical moment in the history of aviation. With the arrival of the jet, propeller-driven aircraft was suddenly aerodynamically inefficient. The U.S. didn't want the Royal Navy Lend-Lease Corsairs, and the British didn't want to pay for it. To satisfy the letter of the law, it was agreed that the British push them over the side. Navy and Marines chose the Corsair as the plane they wanted to keep on. And it was not just a question of the wartime aircraft. new models would be developed and produced. The F-4U was still being produced and backflying combat missions in America's next war. The constant close intervention of the corsairs, operating from the carriers and from within the encirclement at Busan, was an important factor in that move. With the other World War II types, like the Mustangs and Invaders, the F-4Us could carry large loads and loiter for hours. They could deliver accurate close support and tie up road and rail links. As had so often been the case during World War II, the carriers played a major part in asserting control of the skies over Korea. This was ultimately decisive. China's massive reserves could not realistically be risked under the fierce umbrella of American air superiority. From its earliest manifestations as a fighter aircraft, the Corsair had grown remarkably diverse. The Marines had turned it into a dive bomber and rocket platform. The closely coordinated activities of the Marines in Korea also serve to illustrate the outstanding virtues of the Corsair. Big workhorses handled the unsophisticated strips and their buckling matting without complaint. But the severity of the winter caused many problems. There were periods of the war when all aerial activity was suspended. The planes were frozen. By the same token, even the Chinese could not make very much progress in conditions like these. The demand for the Corsair services was such that during the war, many of the planes were recalled from reserve units for use in combat. Their virtues in the close support role were unmatched. The Navy needed them in the front line. Perhaps there were some regrets about the heap of ex-British Corsairs rusting deep in the Pacific. In August 1952, Captain Jesse G. Fulmer became the first American to shoot down a MiG-15 with a propeller-driven plane. Airstrikes by U.S. Marines and Navy Corsairs continued up to the last day of the conflict, 27th of July, 1953.
We had some unexpected help in flight testing the Corsair, which began in February of 1943. I was sitting in the flight ready room, and I got a call from our senior person, Mr. Paul Baker at this time, and he asked if I'd come over and show Charles Lindbergh around the experimental hangar, discuss our projects with him and flying the airplane. I was for a moment overcome because this man had been a hero to so many people for so long, and I certainly was one of them. But I had to collect myself, and I finally did, and after lunch went over and met Lindbergh, and we went down to experimental, had a discussion about the projects, and went behind the classified curtains. He was about the same size I was, 6'4", so it was easy to talk. We could sort of lean together with all the noise and clamor in the experimental shop of metal being pounded, and we got quite a bit said and done. I learned immediately that in dealing with Lindbergh, you measured your facts carefully, because he was an extremely careful person about what he learned and what he heard. This relationship continued for quite a while, for perhaps another couple of years. One of the noted ways that Lindbergh operated was in great care of whatever he did, such as when he would sit in a cockpit of a Corsair after a test flight, even a production test flight, and spend a half an hour reviewing his thoughts, looking at his flight test card, and thinking about the airplane. And nobody would approach him and touch him. Well, when he left the house in this car he had borrowed, I noticed he went around carefully and checked the tires. When he got in, he looked at the instruments and spent quite a bit of time, maybe 5 minutes, just checking this plain old Pontiac, I think it was. And when he finally left, I figured that I had a pretty good car, Lindbergh wouldn't be driving it.
We were having some difficulties with the Corsair right at that time, a few little problems. Like the one was that the engine was cutting out when we were doing altitude gunnery above 20,000 feet. And so I went over to see Colonel Sanderson, said that we need some expert to come up here and help us out a little bit. So he says, well, I'll call General Charlie Wallace and see what we can do. And next thing I knew, he handed me the telephone, and it was the general, and he said, well, what can I do for you, Joe? I had been with him at Guadalcanal, so we knew one another real well. And he said, we'll get you up an expert there right away if you need one. And that's what happened. And the next day, or 2 days later, who showed up but Charles A. Lindbergh? And of course, I'd always been an admirer of his from his flight across the Atlantic, and had looked forward to meeting him. And of course, he said he wanted to go to work right away, and he flew morning, noon, and night, always carried a map in his pocket. He worked on the plane. He found a lot of bugs here and there on these brand new airplanes that we'd just picked up. And he eliminated their problems in a hurry. Not being an engineer, I can't tell you exactly what they were, but the engines functioned perfectly at high altitude. Everything went well. And of course, that was put out all through the Marine Corps in the effort that he put in on that. And then the last thing he said to us after being there a month was, you know, if I had my wish, it would be to fly a tail end Charlie in your outfit. And I said, well, don't worry about that. You ever show up and you want to be flying tail end Charlie. And lo and behold, when we got up to Emerald, who showed up but Charles A. Lindbergh. And he flew every mission during the time that he was there, on dive bombing and strafing Caviang, New Ireland, and Rabaul, New Britain, and all of the sneak missions that we did in the area. So his performance in combat was great.
By the end of the war, the Corsair's days were clearly numbered. Production had finally ceased in December 1952. The last Corsairs in fighter and attack squadron service were relegated to reserve units in December 1954. The reserves would fly them until 1957, and the French continued to use them until October 1964. In Korea, jets were new and still developing, whereas props were well established and refined. F-4Us did the desperate defensive work early in the campaign, and the aggressive work of the latter phases equally convincing. The honor of being the last U.S. Navy user of the F-4U went to Squadron VC-4, which flew its last Corsair, a night fighter F-4U-5N, in December 1955. 12,571 Corsairs were produced. 7,830 of these were built by Model. There were 36 major subtypes, and thousands of minor variations between batches of planes. Their decline from being the world's finest fighter only saw them become the world's finest ground support aircraft. Both Japanese and American pilots acknowledged the Corsair as the Allies' finest fighter, and also agree they were better than anything the Japanese had, the chance fought or sink.
One of the Corsair's greatness items, however, was immediately apparent. We had the fastest naval fighter in the world. The first airplane over 400 miles an hour for a time belonged to the Corsair. One of its greatness features was its high speed at all altitudes. The R-2800 engine gave us, its two-stage engine, gave us an ability to go to nearly 30,000 feet and still be faster than the Zero or competing aircraft. I like to think of George Axtell's comments in finalizing this greatness item. George thought of the airplane as a complete one. And George Axtell was an ace and a hero in the Okinawa campaign, and later on, he led the Death Rattler Squadron into action. And his comments about it were, "It's the best fighter there is. It's rugged and it's a workhorse. You can use it for anything, including dive bombing. And it's very effective. You can shoot anything off of that airplane and it still goes." I thought that literally told us what the airplane was all about for combat.
I'm George C. Axtell. I'm a retired Lieutenant General, United States Marine Corps. I commanded in World War II the VMF 323, and I commanded 312 in Korea, flying Corsairs off carriers. I first saw the F-4U when I was stationed at the Naval Air Station Anacostia. I noticed the airplane that it was a large single-engine aircraft with a large engine, powerful, the large prop, and it looked so graceful and powerful in the landing pattern as well as on the climb out. I was very impressed with the aircraft. What I liked about the airplane that it had power, it was maneuverable, and I thought relatively easy to fly. The first opportunity I had to fly the airplane in combat was in Okinawa in 1945. We entered at the beginning of the Okinawa campaign.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.